You know that feeling that your life isn't just one long, continuous thing, but more like a journey with really distinct chapters? Well, that idea that we all move through these predictable stages, it's not new at all. In fact, it's a way people have been making sense of the human story for centuries. I mean, think about it. Way, way back, Shakespeare wrote about life having 7 ages, from the infant all the way to old age. It's a beautiful idea, but it was more poetry than science, right? It took a few more hundred years for someone to come along and give this idea a real scientific framework. And that's where psychologist Eric Erikson enters the picture. He's the one who gave us this incredible new map for our life's journey. He really shifted the conversation away from some of the older, more controversial theories and created a model that covers our entire lifespan, from beginning to end. But here's the thing, Erickson's map doesn't just show us the ideal path. It's also incredibly useful for understanding what happens when we get stuck, when some kind of trauma knocks us off course and disrupts the whole journey. He called his big idea the psychosocial development theory. And the key concept is this. At each of the 8 stages of life, we're faced with a unique conflict. It's like this tug of war between what we need psychologically on the inside and what the social world is demanding from us on the outside. And how we handle those conflicts, well, that's what fundamentally shapes who we are.
So that brings us to the absolute core question of all of this. What happens when we can't resolve that conflict? What if something happens, an experience that's so disruptive or traumatic that we just can't move forward in a healthy way?
Well, this lays it out perfectly. There are basically 2 paths. If you navigate a stage successfully, you gain a psychological strength, something Erikson called a virtue. Things like hope or will or purpose. But if that conflict goes unresolved, which often happens because of trauma, we develop what he called core pathologies. And these are heavy. Things like a deep-seated mistrust or shame that we then drag with us into the next stages of our lives.
All right, so let's walk through this map and see how it all unfolds. We're going to start right at the beginning with our foundational first steps, where the stakes for the rest of our lives are just incredibly high.
The very first challenge every single one of us faces is trust versus mistrust. This all goes down in the first year and a half of life, a time when we are completely and totally dependent on other people for everything. At this stage, you're basically asking the world one simple question: can I count on you? If your caregivers are reliable, if they're consistent and loving, you learn that the world is a safe, predictable place. But if that care is inconsistent or neglectful or even abusive, well, that's a profound form of developmental trauma that teaches you the world is dangerous and can't be trusted. And the outcome couldn't be clearer. Success here builds the virtue of hope. That's a fundamental belief that even when things get bad, help will be there. But failure, or trauma, it embeds that core pathology of mistrust, which can lead to a whole life colored by fear, suspicion, and a constant feeling of anxiety. Okay, so we're going to jump forward now. After we navigate all the challenges of being a toddler and a young kid, we land in a stage that I think many of us remember very vividly: the teenage years. That intense, sometimes confusing search for who we really are. This is stage 5, identity versus role confusion. This is that classic adolescent struggle, right? Trying to figure out your place in the world, what you actually believe in, what your values are, the whole shebang. What's so fascinating about this stage is that it's kind of a bridge. It connects the black and white morality we learned as kids to the more complex ethics we'll need as adults. We're trying on different hats, exploring jobs, relationships, different social groups, and having a supportive environment is just crucial for that exploration to happen. Getting through this stage successfully gives you the virtue of fidelity, which is really the ability to be true to yourself and your values. But if you don't, the result is role confusion, this nagging, persistent insecurity about who you are and where you're going. And you can really see how an earlier trauma can poison the stage. I mean, how are you supposed to build a stable identity if you can't even trust the world around you, or maybe even yourself? Of course, the journey doesn't just stop when you turn 18. As we move into adulthood, the big questions we ask ourselves start to change. They shift from, who am I, to, what is my contribution? And that brings us to stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, which usually happens in middle adulthood. This is all about our deep-seated need to create or nurture things that are going to outlast us, like raising a family, mentoring others, or contributing to society in a meaningful way.
Success here gives us the wonderful virtue of care. We feel useful, we feel accomplished, but if we feel like we haven't really made our mark, we can experience stagnation. And this often happens when those earlier stages were left unresolved. Think about it. If you're still wrestling with who you are, stuck in that role confusion from your teens, it's going to be incredibly hard to feel like you have something valuable to offer the next generation. And finally, that brings us to the last stop on the map, a time for reflection, for looking back on the entire journey of the life we've lived.
Stage 8 is called integrity versus despair. In our later years, it's natural to look back and take stock. Was my life meaningful? Was it a life well lived? And the answer to that really big question depends almost entirely on how we navigated all of those previous stages.
If you can look back and see your life as coherent and whole, even with all its hardships, that leads to the virtue of wisdom. But a life that's viewed through a lens of regret, of missed opportunities and unresolved conflicts, that can lead to bitterness and ultimately despair. It's the final crushing weight of that mistrust from infancy and that role confusion from youth, all coming to a head in the feeling that your life was unfulfilled.
Now, it's super important to keep a balanced perspective here. Erickson's theory has been massively influential, but it's not perfect. Real life isn't always so neat and tidy, right? The stages aren't always sequential, those age ranges are definitely just estimates, and some of us might wrestle with finding our identity more than once. So it's best to see this as a really helpful map of our journey, not a rigid step-by-step instruction manual. So, I'll just leave you with this to think about. When you look at your own life through this lens, as a series of challenges to navigate, where things that happened in your past can still be shaping your present, how does this map change the way you see your own story?